Okay, we're probably gonna have to wheel in a chair.
We'll be standing actually.
Okay, good.
Sitting all morning.
All right, so guys, today's class is on leases. But this is actually the first of 5 classes on leasing related materials, but I don't want to give you guys a 3 or 4 hour class, so I broke it up. The first one is this one, which just is a overview on the different types of leases. Leases are the lifeblood of commercial real estate. That's the income, and we sell income producing properties. The next class that I'll do probably within a few weeks is on leasing, and that's the steps on renting space. The next one is just getting more familiar with contracts and disclosures, and we'll actually fill out some lease contracts and learn more about some of the disclosure that goes along. Then there's a full class on lease comps, and then the last one is on multifamily, just because multifamily leases are totally different than most of the other commercial leases that we do with offices and retail. So let's just jump right into it. What would you say are some of the main differences between a commercial and residential lease?
Term. Escalations.
The potential for triple net.
Okay, let's go over term. What's the difference?
Responsibilities.
Longer term.
Commercial is usually much longer than residential,
Yes.
and residential are usually 12 months or less. You can do a 6 month, you can do a month to month. Okay, so term is definitely a main one. What else is the main difference?
Escalations.
You have escalations in residential also. Okay. How about when you go to court in front of a judge? Okay, big difference. When you have residential, they're definitely on the tenant side. The tenant has all the rights, and they consider the tenant to be the party at the disadvantage because they're up against a big landlord, a big corporation, a big REIT. So, especially in California, the tenant is at the advantage in court. Where when you got commercial, even in California, the law looks at both parties more equally because even the tenant in commercial is considered to be more sophisticated. They have their access to an attorney to look over, they have their own brokers, so it's more, in commercial, it's more, what does the lease say, okay? In residential, it's more, what about all these rights that you have with tenant landlord law? All right. So what other differences can you think of between residential and commercial?
It's usually maybe like businesses compared to actual people, like just the most part.
Yeah, true.
Sounds like-
Entity, responsibility for repairs, taxes.
County expenses in general.
Okay, so those are all good, and we'll go into some more of that. But I would say the main things to keep in mind when you're looking between the two is the length of the term and how the parties stand when they're in front of a judge. Those are the main ones. Okay, so what rights do you have on any lease in general? Okay, so what is a leasehold estate, a lease? What kind of rights do you have when you have a lease?
Non-disturbance.
Mm-hmm. When they say the right of quiet enjoyment, what does that mean?
Well, you have a right to keep the noise down.
No, it's not about noise.
It's not about quiet hours.
It's about being not disturbed or bothered by the owner, by the landlord.
Oh,
That's what it's a right. That's the right. But basically, when you lease a property, you have all of the rights that an owner has, except for right of encumbrance. You can't sell it. You can't put a lien on it. But every other right is yours when you have a lease. Okay. And landlords forget that, but legally, that's the standing you have when you have a lease.
That's the subordination, from the SNDA part, right? Subordination to the lien holder, to the lender.
Right. Yeah. And we'll go into that in a bit. But yeah, but you know, basically when you have a lease, you have all those rights that, you know, we talk about, which is right of acquire enjoyment, right of possession, right of exclusion, right to keep someone out, but that's more in residential. Because when you have commercial, you also have laws as far as, you know, public dwelling, and, you know, if you're open to the public, you can't have a hotel and say, you know, I only want to serve this color or this, you know. Well, you can sort of get around the income thing, because if you make your nightly rate $2,000 a month, you're probably only going to get rich people if that's what you want. But most of the other public are not going to be able to afford your rates. But you can't, you know, have a restaurant and say, I'm not going to, you know, serve, you know, a protected class, whatever the protected class is. Federal has certain protected classes. California has 3 or 4 more on top of that. So, you know, when you have public accommodations, you also have restrictions there. So the rights in general that you have on a lease are all the rights of ownership except for the right to encumber the property. All right, so have you ever heard that a lease has to be in writing to be enforceable?
No.
Well,
Most leases, especially commercial leases, must be in writing, but there's a few exceptions. What's the exception to the lease being in writing? If it's residential for less than 12 months, it does not have to be in writing, okay? Also, any lease that is month to month, whether it's commercial or residential, is technically a legal lease, but if you don't have the restrictions in writing, the landlord is not going to have much of a case in court when they go and try to enforce something they don't have in writing, okay? All right, so when we talk about the main types of lease, remember we're going to go more into specifics later, but the main types that we talk about are gross lease and triple net lease, and there's also called a percentage lease in retail. Okay, that's more like a shopping center, a mall, like the Grove. Not only do you have your base rent and your CAM charges, but they're also going to get a percentage of your sales, okay? Because in certain locations, they have the power to do that, okay? So how would you define a gross lease?
Covers all expenses, distributes CAM expenses to tenants, typically. Taxes,
And what
insurance,
properties are normally gross leases?
Industrial.
Warehouse, manufacturing,
Office.
office.
Usually office and residential, okay? Are gross leases.
Oh, gross, oh.
Gross. What is usually net or triple net or double net?
Retail.
Retail.
Manufacturing.
There you go.
Industrial.
Okay. Here are some major clauses and terms in leases, more commercial leases that we can go over. You guys should know the co-tenancy clause now, right? Okay, what's co-tenancy clause?
It's
Anchor leaves I bail.
When your lease is tied to a major anchor or something else in the shopping center, like, you know, I have a sub shop, but there's a there's a Starbucks or a Walmart there. If Walmart leaves, I either get to discount rent or I get to like break my lease because that's what's bringing traffic in. So that's co-tenancy clause. Okay, so some of the granting clause. A lease must contain a granting clause where the landlord, and the language can say different things, but it can use words like grant, let, demise, but it's required to create a true lease. All true leases will contain a clause which states that the landlord leases the premises to the tenant. And the reason that it has to have this granting clause is that some leases are really not leases. They're actually a license. And some companies will do the license because a license has different rights for the tenant. Okay. The distinction between a lease and a license is that a lease gives the tenant exclusive possession of the premises against the world, including the landlord, during the term of the lease, while a license gives only a privilege to occupy a space for a particular purpose and the will of the landlord. Similarly, a license is generally considered to be revocable at the will of the landlord, while a lease is not, okay? So you really gotta make sure that your client signed a lease and not a license. Because a lot of the big companies will make it where it doesn't have a granting clause, and unless they're sharp or have their lawyer look it over, they're really signing a license. And it's easier for them to get you out. You don't have as many rights as a tenant. Okay, so these are some important things, and these could all be on the same date, but on most times these are over a period of weeks or months. Effective date is the date which the lease is fully executed, okay? When everyone agrees, there's a meeting of the mind. Occupancy date is the date that the tenant gets the keys and has the right to enter, okay? But that doesn't mean it's ready, doesn't mean that they're moving in yet. The rent commencement date is when the tenant starts paying rent. And why could those be different, those dates?
Rent abatement.
TI
Yes.
improvements.
Sometimes the place could be just a shell,
Shell.
and it takes weeks or months to get it ready. So sometimes they give them a rent holiday, rent abatement, free rent, whatever you want to call it, until then. So basically, the rent commencement date could be different than the date they take occupancy. Okay?
Would that be only in the case when the landlord is doing the improvements?
No,
No?
no.
What happens, so if the tenant is doing the improvements, he can get the same benefit?
But if he can negotiate that, which we'll go into tenant improvements in a bit, but yeah, tenant improvements are negotiable. But yeah, those dates, it doesn't matter who's doing the work. 'Cause that's a separate part of,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. All right. Rent, okay. Now rent sounds simple, but it's not, because especially, now in gross rent, that's pretty simple. You just pay a certain amount, it covers everything. But once you get to triple net, you have a lot of different terms. You have base rent, also called minimum rent, okay? So when you see a lot of commercial property advertised, it looks attractive because it's just the base rent, okay? But then there could be almost the same amount, depending on, what the CAM charges are, with CAM dues and other different things that they're charging for. So there's we know the three nets, and you got the single net, double net, and triple net, and then there's also what's called absolute net, and then there's even one, absolute net is when, because triple net can sometimes still include roof and structure, and sometimes even parking lot, so you gotta check that. But the absolute net doesn't have any cost to the landlord, and the tenant has to pay even roof and structure, okay? There's another type of absolute net that some lenders use, and it's called bondable net, okay? And we'll go into that more, but basically it's where any, even like insurance premiums, if there's just about any cost associated with that property is passed on to the tenant. And some lenders want that because they want to be able to know the financials and exactly what's coming in, and that nothing has to go out on that property. Okay, so we talked about the percentage lease, and that is pretty restricted to not only shopping centers but prime shopping centers. I mean, you got to have a pretty good location to get people to be willing to not only pay base rent and CAM charges and a percentage of the sales, okay? So that's where you're at the Grove, and as soon as you open up, you're gonna get lots of business just from the location, okay?
Don't they usually charge a little less for the base rent when they're getting a percentage?
Not always.
Still.
Yeah, it depends on, depends on their occupancy rate, depends on the traffic and all that, but I use the Grove a lot because it's our busiest here, but the Grove is the second highest in the whole country per square foot. So they have a waiting list.
Yeah.
So they'll get you as much as they can because
right.
they can. Yeah. Okay, so this one is pretty obvious. Permitted uses and exclusives. An exclusive is similar to a co-tenancy clause, but not exactly. But you open up a sub shop in a little strip center, you can get an exclusive that you're going to be the only sub shop, so that nobody else is going to come in and compete with you in your same shopping center. Permitted use, whatever you're licensed for and what your lease says is what you can do there. You can't automatically just change without, not only getting new licenses from the city, but also getting permission from your landlord, because they might have just signed someone that's going to be doing the same thing right next to you. Okay? All right, tenant improvements. Besides CAM and maintenance, the biggest issues you have in commercial, and especially the negotiation of a new lease, is the tenant improvements. It's always a big back and forth. And basically, this is the way it is that you get a space and there's something called a vanilla shell, where basically all it is drywall and like concrete floors, okay? Then there's also called a gray shell, where it's not drywall, it's just concrete walls and concrete floors. So depending on how developed it is going to depend on how much money it's going to take to get it up to your needs, okay? But if you're just going to have a showroom where all you need is drywall paint and carpeted floors, because you're going to have displays out, you're going to like a mattress store. That's simple, okay? But a doctor's office needs a lot more. So your TI allowances can go anywhere from $20, $30 a square foot to 80 or 100, okay? So when you're talking to 10,000 square foot, 20,000 square foot, this is something that can be tens of thousands on the lower end, but normally is going to be like 75, 100, a couple $100,000 on getting that place ready to be occupied by the tenant, okay? So here's how they do it. Some landlords will just give you $50,000, but they want to see proof that you're giving it to some contractors, licensed contractors and things. So they give you money as a TI allowance. But most landlords don't want to just give you money, so they would rather you take it in rent credit. So they give you $50,000 and the rent's $5,000 a month. You don't have to pay rent for the first 10 months to make that up, okay?
Correct. I have a base rent increase of 7.9% on a $200,000 TI right now. So base rent is base rent, and then we have it's about $370,000, and then we have 7.9% of $200,000 in TI improvements. So it's going to be 7.9% of the TI added to the base rent for the base rent increase.
Normally, but everything is negotiable.
Yeah.
And normally, the other thing that becomes a sticking point is that a lot of times landlords will give you the rent holiday on base rent, but they still want their CAM. Okay, so that is negotiated, because a lot of new startups, they want CAM and they don't want to have, rent holiday to them is we don't have to pay anything for this amount of months. But to the landlord, they're like, we're giving you a rent holiday, but that's base rent. We still have CAM charges, and so you still have to pay CAM charges. So everything is back and forth negotiated. Okay. The other way that TI can be done is that the landlord does the work themselves. So it can be done paid for and done by outside contractors. It can be done by the tenants if they happen to be contractors themselves or able to do it, or it can be done by the landlords themselves. And then how they do the rent reduction is negotiable, because some companies, they don't want just 6 months off. They'd rather have that lump amount, prorated over the 5 years. So that basically their $5,000 a month rent, all that becomes $3,500 over the full term. So all that can be negotiated, okay? But TI is tenant improvements, and that's basically what it takes to get the space ready for whatever the needs are of the tenant. So maintenance, it's a touchy area, but basically it's just one of those things that the lease is what's going to decide what's in there. The lease is going to decide who pays for when the roof goes down. The other big thing is when you are even a triple net tenant, your insurance company sometimes will have restrictions, or you have to make sure your insurance coincides with what your lease says, because sometimes it doesn't. Like I've had issues where we would have like a fire in the back of the property, and it was full triple net, and so basically we had a dumpster fire. Some homeless guy did a dumpster, and there's like $5,000 because the whole electrical panel is burnt out on one of these tenants. And so the tenant tries to do a claim with their insurance company, and the insurance company says, no, that's not covered under your policy, so you got to pay it all out of pocket. But once you pay for it out of pocket, it will be on your new policy, so if it happens again, it'll be covered.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's the insurance business.
Yeah, exactly. So, you have to definitely, go ahead.
So then, like, what you're saying, after your 5-year lease, after that's up, it's so important to have it in your lease, in the contract, stating that your tenants are gonna do all the demolition and taking those interior walls out, $50,000 worth and so forth, if it's not
No.
in the lease?
That can be negotiated, but sometimes they just leave it as, and the thing is that if they're in good shape, like if you spend all that money to set it up as a doctor or dentist office, if all you got to go in there is patch up some walls and like put some new carpet or clean it, and then you can release it as the same thing.
But only to a medical building?
Right. So some landlords will just go ahead and do that so that they don't have to really pay TI the next time.
Okay.
But if the new person coming in wants it all torn down, then they have to like do a new TI allowance unless they did negotiate that with that original tenant.
Gotcha.
Okay? But that original tenant probably is not going to want to do that much and establish their business and then leave in 5 years.
Right.
So normally they're going to have renewal clauses, because most commercial, they're going to want 5, 10, but they're going to want to have options to renew.
Renew it,
Because once they get their business established, they don't really want to move.
okay.
Okay? All right. You're going to let me know when we get down to 2 minutes, right?
You got 7.
All right. Insurance, I went over that a little bit, but you definitely have to have 2 types of insurance. You have to have liability coverage, and you also have to have fire and casualty that protects the building owner from. Okay, we know about defaults and assignment and subletting. There's a difference between subletting the space, because then the original tenant is still responsible. You can also do assignment, and with that, the landlord will get approval over who you're bringing in, and once you do that assignment, in most cases, the original tenant can actually get off the lease and not be responsible anymore. Okay, and commercial subletting and assignment is a lot more common. It's not really allowed in most residential.
I'm sorry, usually you see recapture clauses for that. You have to watch out for that.
Yes. Okay. So, SDNA, who knows what an SDNA is?
Subordination, non-disturbance, and atonement.
Yes. And when does that come into play?
Due diligence.
Oh,
Normally, it's going to come into play when the owner is refinancing or selling, but basically a new, the lender is going to want to make sure that their loan is in first place and that any, leases are subordinate to their lease, okay, to their loan. Now the estoppel certificate, where does that come in? It's almost at the same time.
Yeah.
But this is basically where in your lease, in your commercial lease, it will say that you are required to fill out this estoppel certificate and provide it, because a lot of commercial properties, they're going to want to refinance or they're going to want to sell, and the new bank is going to go to the tenant and they're going to want to sign documents saying my lease is in effect, and everything that's in my lease is, they don't want made up leases to make the property look more valuable. So they want to make sure every lease is valid and all the maintenance that the owner says has been done is done, and that they're happy and that they're going to plan on staying there the rest of, what their lease is, that it's a valid lease. Okay. All right. So I have handouts that that we have that we can email to you guys, and it has some sample leases. It has a lot more of the detail on what I gave you guys. What questions you guys have on any of this in general?
If you have somebody out of state, local economy, you really don't know how to advise, and they're about to execute a lease, it's going to kind of tie into their PSA. It's going to be part of an acquisition. They're trying to negotiate with the tenant. They're asking you if you should look at a fixed percentage rent escalation, 2%, 3%, whatever, or a variable percent escalation, like a CPI index increase, CPI increase percentage, like we were looking at 300% of CPI increase. How do we as a team advise best on that to make sure, considering it's a local economy, 25
Yeah, you can do the rent comps on CoStar, but I also call the local leasing guys in that area, and I pick their brain, because they're the ones that know that local area and how things are done and what's going on and what's going to be going on. So yeah.
For example, we had that TI $200,000+, and then the base rent increase or adjustment was going to be based on 7.9% of that. I mean, who comes up with that math just to make sure that it's really going to be a functional thing 2,500 miles away with that local market as an economy? And
well, I compare. I check. I do my research myself to kind of get a ballpark, but then I call I'll check on CoStar and see who's leasing the places right around there. They're the ones that know, and then I say, does this seem about right to you? Yeah. Okay. All right. So make sure you guys. No, I'm happy. Yeah, we're good. So make sure you guys sign the sign-in sheet, and I also want you guys to. I'm doing a class on handling objections. So what I would like you to do is pass this around and write down what objections you're getting on cold calls and on listing appointments, and I'll cover that in the class because it'll be more relevant to you guys. So, all right, that's all. Thanks, guys.